Death of the staff. Why sheet music fails modern musicians. We want to go into a bit more detail about the pros and cons of sheet music because it's basically the default for writing down and reading musical ideas, that being our songs, our tunes, our melodies, there being a conceptual framework that if you don't know how to read and write sheet music, you're not a real musician, which might have more of an argument in the past and still could hold some sway. You could make the argument, but going into the future, I believe that will change for some of the reasons we'll talk about here. Let's look at the historical context. Sheet music was a solution for a different era. So obviously, the idea of writing down the musical information in a systematic way is a huge invention, but it was done at a time before we had computers. It was done at a time when we're really looking at the major scale as the main mode that we're going to be basically playing in, at a time when the piano was basically the computer of music. So everything is going to be in essence on a piano based, and when multiple instruments were the new modern thing. So you want more instruments, a bigger orchestra, so you can have more different tones coming in as you then have to organize all of those things happening very specifically with something like sheet music. So it was invented before recording technology. So remember now, these days, it's not so much about having the biggest orchestra, because then you have the biggest variety of sounds, which you have to then organize at one time because they have to all be playing in unison. No, now it's typically more about, I'm going to be pulling all these different sounds together and then stacking them in a software kind of environment. So we want to have a system that's going to be as efficient as possible for the modern era, which typically isn't so much trying to get a whole bunch of people playing the same thing at the same time, but rather being able to stack the information in a very efficient way, typically. Designed for copying by hand and sight reading. So obviously it was built at a time when everything was going to be done by hand, and you need the sight reading for it rather than computer-based information. Now, part of the problem with this, of course, is going to be we don't have the same kind of lines that you could just draw on the sheet of paper. You could, but you're basically making, in essence, a spreadsheet. So we might as well just say, hey, look, this is basically a spreadsheet. Let's put it in a spreadsheet. There's this conception that if you look at the sheet music, that's some kind of artistic thing, like it's going to be a painting or something. And I get that it is artistic in that way, but then it doesn't make sense that if you convert the same thing to like an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, that all of a sudden becomes, I don't know, capitalistic, business oriented. You can't be creative in an Excel worksheet. This is incorrect. This is basically an Excel worksheet that we're already working on. We might as well transpose it into actual, the most efficient format. Piano-centric worldview. So we have the treble, bass, clef logic. So in other words, of course, the piano is in essence the computer of music before we had computers, allowing you to play both the melody and chords at the same point in time. Therefore, if you are a composer and you're trying to basically compose for an entire orchestra, you would like to have an instrument that you can play as many things at the same kind of time, which would be basically the piano, and then be able to experiment with that with different kinds of instruments to get different timbre that's going to be coming into play. But obviously these days we have computers. Computers actually allow you a larger capacity to test different things out than the piano. So therefore, putting things in or taking the problems in piano logic and applying them to a computer system is not the most efficient thing to do. It's important for piano players to understand that logic, but if you don't play the piano, then you don't really need to learn the piano in order to learn music theory, because the computer is now, it's going to take the place. And again, this isn't me saying that. It's not like I have any control over that. This is what I predict will happen. The computer is now going to take the place of the piano as the computer of music. And therefore, we should basically be learning things from that standpoint to organize the information and then try to specialize in particular areas for our particular instrument. So gave composers control in a world without playback. So obviously, if you have no ability to play back the information, then the piano, once again, is great because you could still stack things together with two hands on the piano, whereas most other instruments, you can only play one line at a time. But today, we can, of course, stack the music in like a MIDI system or something and write it as we compose it, play it back at the same point in time. Therefore, if our focus is composing, what we would like to be able to do is have the data input as efficient as possible so that we can then play it back and see how it sounds with a computer system, and then we can apply that to whatever we want to apply it to, an orchestra or a band, or we can get more detailed in our stacking. So why it's no longer fit for purpose, the sheet music that is. We don't need symbols, we can hear everything now. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm saying that we should not write things down. We should still have the capacity to write things down. It's just that we're not as dependent on writing things down and then listening to them. We can do them at the same time. Most people are composing by writing down their musical ideas and then playing them back at the same time, even if they don't have an instrument, because the instrument they're using is the DAW. The computer is the instrument. We write it down and then we run it back and we listen to it as we're composing. So recordings are the real medium. So now learners have YouTube, we've got DAWs, we've got tabs and so forth. Most musicians today learn by ear or shape, not notation. Now remember, I'm not saying that we are going to remove notation completely. I think we still need it. We need it in some format in like a DAW system, but we want the information to be as efficient as possible so that we can now interact with it as we compose it, not just write it down and then play it, right? But so sheet music is piano centric. So remember, if you're a composer, then it would make sense before computers to do so with a piano. You have two hands on the piano, so you have more capacity to play more things at the same time as you're thinking about writing this for an orchestra where you have a whole bunch of people playing things at the same time. But today, the computer does that. So the staff only makes sense if you're playing in a piano. In other words, you've got the white key, natural notes. Now let's look at this from the standpoint of someone who's not a piano player, but wants to stack their beats, wants to write something in software. Possibly they play some other instrument, or possibly they just do electric music. They just make their own music with a computer. The computer is, in essence, an instrument. If you tell that person, this is how you can do the data input most efficiently, we'll hook up a keyboard or a piano keyboard to the computer, you're going to introduce a bunch of ideas that will confuse that person beyond what they need to confuse, meaning the piano does not have even keys. So that means that the white keys are in one particular key, the key of C, and every time you move into every other collection of 12 notes, you have a different pattern, not because there's different symmetry in the actual music distance, but because there's a different shape to the keys on the piano. That's something that you should not be introducing to people as a problem unless they are learning the piano, right? Because if they're not learning the piano, then what we want to learn is the distance between all of the notes. And we can do that with just a simple numbering system, which would be transposable. So telling people that the natural notes are A through G is an outcome of the piano, which if someone is not learning the piano is no longer the computer of music. The DAW is the computer of music. Don't teach someone piano things that are going to mess them up if they're not learning to play the piano is going to be the point, right? That's what's going to happen in the future. Same for the sharps and flats tacked on. So the sharp and flat idea, meaning when we had the staff before, if you're the composer working on the computer of music back in the day, you're saying, hey, look, it makes sense for me to write everything and say, I have only these A through G notes, and I'm just going to adjust the staff to show sharps and flats on it so that I can basically memorize the pattern that is unique to the piano because of the different key size of the piano, but doesn't really apply to any other instrument. So the whole idea of naming how many sharps and flats are in each particular 7-note collection of notes for all 12 7-note collections is totally a thing that makes any sense on the piano. Even on the piano, I don't think it's the most optimal way to do it. But it's certainly causing more confusion than benefit than if you're just working on a MIDI system, right? The guy just working on MIDI is going to say, hey, look, I have a 7-note collection. These 7 notes can be numbered 1 through 7, and then the 5 notes that are outside can have a 0.5 on it, and that then could be assigned to all 12 collections of notes. You don't need sharps and flats are not necessary typically. So guitar, voice, synths, and drums don't map cleanly. So in other words, if you're saying the data input into the DAW system is going to be using a piano to do the data input, then you try to put other things on it, like a voice, synths on it, drums on it, that you're playing with a piano keyboard, that again doesn't really make sense. It would make a lot more sense to just assign the 10 key for like a typewriter, the numbers to those types of things, or possibly assign something on the typewriter keyboard, not the piano keyboard. Guitar thinks in frets and shapes, not ledger lines. And this applies not just to the guitar, but any stringed instrument except the piano, right? Because the piano is basically kind of like a computer here, right? Any stringed instrument, you're basically thinking in terms of shapes. And that's actually more aligning to the actual idea of music than the piano, because the piano distorts the idea of moving between keys, transposing, because of the shape of the keys on the piano not representing the actual distance between the notes. So the distance between the notes are all the same. The shapes of the keys on the piano are not all the same. On most other stringed instruments, it's all symmetrical. The distance is all the same on a fretboard, just like it would be on an Excel worksheet. That actually makes more logic from if you're just trying to map out the shape of music. So the sharp flat problem. So enharmonics make it worse, not better. So on a piano, because we're writing things with this sharp and flat idea, and we want to have all the letters A through G sharp, A through G on each of the 12 7-note collections, you end up with sometimes voicing something as a B sharp, which is the same note as a C, or an E sharp, which is the same as an F, or a C flat, which is the same as a B. These two names for the exact same pitch is clearly not optimal from a normal standpoint. Again, you can make an argument for it from a piano standpoint. I still don't think it's the best way to do it from a piano standpoint, but certainly from non-piano standpoint, it doesn't make any sense. And notice, if you're a guitar player or anything other than the piano and you're using staff, the staff is basically going to be set up to say, hey, look, these are going to give you the lines in the alphabet, A through G. But if you're playing in anything other than C major, then we have to assign how many sharps and flats are going to be there. And then you're going to determine the lines in accordance with, what key you're in, defined by how many sharps and flats are there. That's not the most efficient way to do it. That clearly doesn't map out well into like a computer type of system. And again, it's kind of cool that it works, but it's not it's certainly not the most efficient way to map things out. So I don't think that's the way things are going to happen, basically, going forward in the future. So the same pitches has multiple spellings. That's not the most efficient thing to do. From just an engineering standpoint, talk to a computer science engineer, they're going to say, well, that's crazy. Like, what are you doing? Like, that's not how you would build the thing if we were starting from scratch. So functionally redundant in digital and MIDI environments. Again, you have two notes for the same pitch. That's bad, right? That doesn't make any sense. So bad for learners, bad for software, it's bad for logic.